you are joining us from. And that gets me every time. uh, um, Welcome to our monthly workshop from MIPSA as part of our the University of Missouri St. Louis and UMKC's TIPSID grant. These monthly workshops really want to address post-secondary education for individuals with disabilities and also offer professional development and workshops for working with and inclusion for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Today, we have a really exciting one for everyone, and I'm happy to introduce Catherine McLaughlin from Elevatus Training. She's the CEO, and I'm going to pass it off to her to have her introduce herself and the topic.
Great, thank you. It's good to be here and see all of you on Zoom, now that we're all in Zoom land. As Jonathan said, I'm Catherine McLaughlin, and I've been a sexuality educator and trainer for over 25 years. And originally when I was working, I worked for Planned Parenthood in New Hampshire. That's where I live now. And I was doing general sexuality education and started to get requests for from developmental disability agencies or special educators saying, can you help us with this? We know this is an important topic. And so I started to provide trainings. And then also at that time, there weren't a lot of sexuality education curricula for people with developmental intellectual disabilities. And so I started working with Green Mountain Self Advocates. And they were great because I was an educator and I was used to, oh, I've got a gig to do. I'll create a lesson. I'll write a curriculum. I'll do this, I'll do that, and then I'll teach it. And they were like, excuse us, no, we want to be part of creating it. And not only that, we want to be one of the teachers of the curriculum as well. So it was an aha moment for me around, maybe I didn't know everything that needed to be taught to everyone. And that curriculum is something that I train people in all over the country. And we have a 3-day training on how to become a sexuality educator and trainer. And I'll tell you about that at the end. But that's a lot of the work that I do, plus these sort of webinars and in-services and that sort of thing. This couple that are on the screen, they've been married 28 years and they both have intellectual disabilities, and they were at a training on being a sexuality educator. So I've done some work in Michigan. I'm doing some work in New York now on training self-advocates to be sexuality educators, and they're teamed up with a professional as well. I've also done some work with different universities around how do you talk about sexuality and relationships, longer sessions on this. But I think a lot of people are excited that people with developmental disabilities are part of the higher education system, but then also like, whoa, what do we need to teach them? What do we need to talk about around sexuality and relationships? So what I'm going to focus on in the next 50 minutes or so is really just looking at, the lack of education, what can happen, which is, you're probably well aware of some of that. But also, what do we want for sexuality education for people with developmental disabilities? And then teach you just a couple of tools around managing your values and answering questions. So you have a couple of tools you can put in your toolbox. So this first one, wait, what? You want me to talk about sexuality and relationships is the title of this presentation. And we're going to start off with looking at messages that we actually received around sexuality, and then messages that people with intellectual and developmental disability receive around sexuality. We're going to talk about the impact of the lack of sex education. We're going to define a term called sexual self-advocacy, and what does that mean, and how can we support people with intellectual and developmental disabilities being sexual self-advocates. We'll also look at barriers for you all in addressing sexuality and relationships with the students on campus. And the two tools we're going to look at are looking at our values and how do we manage those, and also how we answer questions about sexuality if you get them from students. All right, and basically that's also the agenda as well. But I usually have a couple of group agreements when I do sexuality workshops. And so since this is a shorter amount of time, you may not be telling as many stories as we do in long day, trainings, but any sort of story or situation that's brought up, we'll leave that story here, but what we learn from that story, we can take with us. It's okay to pass and just listen, like many people are doing, especially on webinars. Also sort of notice your assumptions too. Are you assuming that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities don't want to be in relationships? Are you assuming that they're all heterosexual? Just sort of notice your assumptions around that. And then take space, make space. And that you may have heard that group agreement before around if you're more of a talker or more of a chatter in the chat box, maybe, hang back a little bit and let others take some space. So you're making space for others. And don't yuck my yum is another one. These are sort of sexuality education ones. So to not have a reaction if somebody brings up something. Yeah, so don't yuck my yum. And so does that seem like that's okay to do? Work all right for people? Great. So in the chat, so I'm going to use the chat a little bit just to kind of see what's on your minds. So in the chat, can you just say your name and then what was the primary message that you got about sexuality while growing up? What kind of messages did you get? So just introduce yourself, just your first name is fine, and what your messages were. I'll give you a minute. Don't talk or have sex until married. Yes. Message that sexuality was normal and to always be safe. Shame. Oh, they're coming in fast now. Abstinence is the best. Sex, what is that? Sex happens, but don't actually talk about it. Don't get pregnant. Don't get a girl pregnant. Be smart. Abstinence. Shouldn't be talking about this. Lots and lots of shame. Yes. Private type of discussion. Abstinence based. Wait till you're married. Don't get pregnant. Wait till you're married. Don't get pregnant or get herpes. It's bad. We don't talk about it. Yeah. Sex is negative. It was negative in my house. Don't have sex when you're married, or only have sex if you're sure you're going to marry that person. Yes, wait until you're married, only to have kids. Right, wait until you're married. So yeah, lots of different messages. And I think I might have read one positive message. So we tend to give negative messages in our culture about sexuality and sex in particular. So someone said, I did have a very progressive health teacher who taught us about pleasure and consent. Excellent. Yes. So once in a while, some positive things come through, right? Yeah. So one thing with messages too is like, what do you think are the messages that people with developmental disabilities get around sexuality? And you can put those in the chat as well. What do you see as some of their messages? No sex, right? Yes, in capital. None, not for you. None, yeah. Avoid, you're just a child. Hetero, if anything. Shouldn't have sex, no children. Yeah. Messages avoided. You have no desires. Yeah, right. Yep. Never have kids. Shouldn't be sexual. Yeah, so many of you got negative messages, but people with disabilities get even more intense negative messages. Thinking of them as children, right? All of those things. And many self-advocates have told me that they were in the mainstream health class in high school and then were removed during the sexuality unit. So they could learn about nutrition and physical activity, but then removed during the sexuality unit. So again, that this isn't for you, you're too young, all of that. Yes. So what we, here are just a few messages that people with disabilities have told me, but you really covered many of them. You know, you're not sexual, you shouldn't have sex, you probably don't even want to have sex, you're innocent and childlike and you need protection from sexuality in relationships. And then lots of other sort of negative, you know, you're not able to make decisions or problem solve and that sort of thing. But also one of the things they notice is that the messages they receive are different than their non-disabled siblings. they notice that there's different conversations happening. So one of the things we can do in our role as professionals, or if you're a parent of a child with a developmental disability, is you can give positive messages, and you think about all the negative ones that everyone wrote that they personally got. And then once in a while you get a positive one, and what a difference that can make in your life. When we're not looking at something that is such a big part of people's lives as so negative. So we can give positive messages similar to these, like sexual feelings and needs are healthy and normal. It's okay to have questions and be curious. It's your right to have a relationship. It's okay to ask for what you need. Sex is a positive and pleasurable part of life. Yeah, you don't have to be in a sexual relationship. I got to check that, why that's a typo. You are a sexual person. So we can give those messages to people. It's okay to be curious and ask questions. It's okay to want to be in a relationship. Let's talk about it. So that's one, sort of one little tip, is think about what are the messages I'm giving here. And I know my kids are grown, well, 24 and 21. And I remember when they were younger thinking, what's the message I want to give here, when they asked a question or anything. And so I think we can do that. Just think about, ooh, I'm being really negative, or I want to be positive. How do I change that message? All right, so we've got messages. And then, lack of sex education. I just mentioned that self-advocates were taken out of class. The report just came out from SECUS, Sexuality Information Education Council of the United States, on the lack of sex education in high schools for students with disabilities. So we know it's an issue. It's an issue for all students before they get to college, but in particular for students with disabilities. So oftentimes lack the basic information. And I work with people with disabilities that are, a man who's 50 years old who has no idea how babies are made. And so we need to start giving information. So what in the chat, if you want to write a few things, like what have you seen happen due to a lack of education? Maybe on campus, just maybe in general. What have you noticed that because of a lack of education is happening in people with disabilities' lives? Not knowing how to properly show affection. Oops, I need to move that. Or interest in potential partners. Yeah, not knowing how do you let someone know you like them, and unsafe practices, victims and perpetrators, sure, dangerous sexual situations, complaints based on miscommunication, sure, misconceptions. Yeah, a lot of misunderstandings, miscommunication, misinterpreting, because they don't have any sexuality education. And many people say that the education that they do get is from television, which, isn't always the best sexuality educator, and easy targets for abuse. Sure. Yeah. So lots of negatives, being either the perpetrator or a victim, being lonely be another one. Sexual relationships being okay and not dirty. Right, thinking there is something wrong with them if they have sexual feelings. Sure, yeah. So feeling shame, which was also listed in some of the people at this webinar too. So lots of shame, and there's something wrong and bad about what you're feeling. Yeah. Right, and maybe lack of terminology, right? So this one in this chat says, they said they had oral sex and what they meant was kissing. Right. So making sure, that's another tip, is making sure we understand what the person's asking, or, making sure we're clear about what they mean by certain things. So that's a great example. So not having the terminology, not having the education. All right. Here are just some statistics, and there's many different statistics, but this one is really focused on intimate partner violence. And it was a small group, the study of young people, actually young adults, that were taking a sexuality education class. So it's not 85% of people with disabilities say that their romantic relationships were part of their lives since high school. This particular group who signed up for the class. But I think the important part is looking at that 60% of them who had been in relationships report that they had experienced interpersonal violence. And then down below is the type of violence, and that 40% did not seek assistance when this was occurring. So this sort of validates some of your responses about the lack of education, what can happen. So abuse. But also you might, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the National Public Radio series on Abused and Betrayed, and it's about people with developmental disabilities and sexual abuse. And what they looked at national crime statistics, and they found that people with IDD are 7 times more likely to be sexually abused than someone without. And also if they looked at women with IDD, 12 times more likely than a woman without. So the rates are so high, and part of that is that there's many reasons, but part of it is just lack of education. And then there's also some other statistics here on pregnancy and sexually transmitted infections and higher rates among people with developmental disabilities. So we know that the negatives, right? Lack of education. But also, we know they need sexuality education, but I also ask self-advocates, well, why do you want and need sexuality education? And this is how they responded. This is Green Mountain self-advocates. So we can learn to have healthy relationships, so we aren't lonely. So we're able to make informed choices, so we can pick the right person. For the toughest part of the relationship, making it last, so we can be safe, because we all have desires and needs, and that's okay. So that people know their rights, so that we can be sexual self-advocates and not just self-advocates. So sexual self-advocacy, I mean, a lot of self-advocates say that it's harder to be a sexual self-advocate because people aren't viewing you as a sexual being, like we mentioned earlier. So when they bring up, oh, I want to get a job, or I'd like to live on my own, people say, oh, great, all right, let's set some goals. Let's figure out what you need to do to get there. But if they say, I want to meet someone, or I want to start dating, or I want to have time alone with my partner, people get nervous and there's this awkward silence. And so self-advocates say it's hard to advocate for yourself when you get those kinds of reactions from others. So the curriculum that I wrote is really focused on sexual self-advocacy. How do we speak up for ourselves, for the right to be in a relationship, as well as in a relationship, how do you speak up? So it's twofold, really, for people with disabilities. People without disabilities, we kind of assume that eventually they'll be in a relationship, although many of you got the message not until marriage. You had to get married before you were a sexual being. But in general, we assume that most people will be in a sexual romantic relationship at some point. But for people with disabilities, it's the exact opposite. So they often have to advocate for that right. Great. And then just thinking about effective sexuality education, it's sex positive, or we give positive messages, and it's not fear-based. I don't know if any of you have seen the Mean Girls scene with the Madeline's nodding her head. Yes. Yeah. So it's the gym teacher who's teaching sexuality, and he says, if you have sex, you will get chlamydia and you will die, right? I mean, that's fear. It's trying to control sexuality. So let's give a lot of like really negative stuff, so then no one will even want to do it. I mean, a lot of sex education classes in high schools show the Birth movie, right? Because they think, oh, that'll scare them out of doing that. So we want to be more positive and sex positive, sexuality positive. It covers many needed topics. And this population, although many have been able to participate in the mainstream health class, they need more than that. They need more around the different types of relationships, and how do you touch in those relationships, and what kind of topics do you talk about in those relationships? What's public, what's private? How do you read emotions? So there's additional topics that are needed as well. Effective sexuality empowers people and gives them information so they can make their own choices in their lives. So it teaches them how to make decisions as well. Is inclusive of all gender and sexual identities, so no one feels invisible in our classes or in our discussions. Many people have told me that growing up as a gay or lesbian adolescent, they really felt invisible. So effective sexuality education includes language and discussion of all gender identities and sexual orientations. And it helps people become sexually healthy and have positive relationships versus, relationships that are abusive or exploitive or really negative. So effective sexuality education. So if you could get your fingers going again with the barriers, what kind of barriers do you face in addressing sexuality with people with IDD or students on campus? What gets in the way? If you can put a few things in the chat, that would be great. Parents, yep. Infantilizing, yes. Yep. Family fears, families not wanting us to teach it, yes. I just don't know how to do it, yeah, absolutely. Parent pushback, differentiated learning levels, yes. Infantilizing, yeah, yep. Family, yes. Communication, yeah, so there's a lot of barriers. Don't give them any ideas. Yeah, so there's lots and lots of barriers for all of us. Yes, so this idea of if you teach something, then what if bad things happen? Right, so we feel sort of overly responsible, and that if we talk about it, it gives them ideas, and yeah, and all of that isn't true. And we know that for example, parent-child communication, when they talk to their kids, they're less likely to have sex and more likely to use protection if they have an open relationship with their families. People already have ideas, right? It's biology. People already have ideas. So if anything, we're helping people by giving them some accurate information. Yes, plain language. Yeah. And the curriculum that I wrote, the self-advocates reviewed it and we used plain language. And so, yeah, that's a piece, is having the materials to be able to convey some of these concepts too. Yeah. And I think working with parents is, that's really tricky. It's a whole nother webinar we could do, but yeah, I think parents, being really empathetic, but also letting them know the risk of not educating. So sort of like what I did on the PowerPoint, these are the things we're seeing with a lack of education. And I always ask parents, what worries you about your child learning about sexuality and relationship? What worries you? So you can get underneath and find out what is the worry in there, that they'll have sex with everyone. That's just not how it works, Yes. Someone also put relevant material for 2021. Yeah. I did update my curriculum. Online dating, that's another one. Yes, that's one that I don't have in my curriculum, but I do have sexting and social media. I added a lesson 2 years ago because people kept saying that's missing from this. And I also added gender identity as another lesson. But online dating, yes, right. There's a lot going on technology wise, and it's hard to keep up with it too. Yeah. So, so materials and keeping up with the times make it a barrier, and parents and worry, just feeling worried about it. So I think one thing that many professionals that I've worked with struggle with is, and someone said in the chat, to be honest, I just don't really know how to talk about it, right? So many of us got the don't talk about it. We weren't exposed to like, what does a normal, healthy conversation sound like? How do you do that even? So one of the things that many professionals do is they fall back on their values because they don't have these role models for how do you talk about this. So they use their values, because it's really the only tool that they have. But really, when we're sexuality educators, we need to be aware of our values and set them aside. And so that's a really difficult thing. And so today, what I'm going to talk about is how do we manage our values, and then give you a tool for answering questions as well, because it's hard to say, well, don't share your values and then not give you anything else to use. So there's some values that are okay to share, and I'll talk about that, and many that are not okay to share, and we'll make sure you got that distinction. But we're not going to actually well, you can take a look at this, but here's an example of what I do when I teach people about values. I have you look at these different scenarios and you write down whether you agree or disagree with them. It's okay to have values. Your purpose isn't to be valueless. It's really about just knowing which ones push your buttons, which ones are difficult for you and why. So you can see there's lots of different possibilities here around which ones bother you. And so the first step is really just being aware of what your values are. There's nothing wrong. It's good to have values, nothing wrong with values. But if I ask some of you, what do you think of number 3? You might say, oh, it's fine. And others would say, no, it's not. So those are the value. These kind of values we're not going to share because they're not common values. They're not, if I said blah, 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 everyone would raise their hand. Yeah, that's fine. So there's these opinions kinds of value pieces here that we want to just be aware of what they are so we can learn to set them aside. So I'm going to just have you think about this facts versus values and making sure you're clear about the difference, right? So facts is what is true and proven, and it's established through observation and measurement. And values are more about what ought to be, should, or supposed to be. It's really a statement of your own personal beliefs. So those situations that I posted, those are values. Whether you think that's okay or not is a value. So we want to make sure we're sharing facts. So we want to ask ourselves, is that always true? Is that true? And think that through. So in the chat, if you could just put in your thoughts about, well, what would happen if you shared your values with some of the students on campus? Now, I'm not talking about parents. Parents, that's their job to share values. But as a professional, what could happen if you shared your values when you were talking about sexuality with a student? What are some of the consequences that might come up? Title IX, so like harassment, do you mean? Or lose their trust, depending on the values, depending on the student, become internet famous. Sharing values may seem to alienate, fired. Okay, yeah. Yep. Might be tied to religious beliefs. Yeah, they may jump on board even if it isn't what they believe, which is dangerous. Yeah, parents, when you talked about parents as a barrier, they could get really upset with you. And they often worry that you're going to teach your own values when you talk to my child about sexuality. So that's the piece, is saying, no, I only share facts. I might give a range of values or a range of opinions and facts, but I don't try to impose my values. And many young people have values before they even get to campus. So it's not like they don't have any and you're going to impose on them. So then I think the next question is, so how do you keep your values to yourself? And that's really tricky, right? But you probably do it for lots of different kinds of things, right? So what are just a few tips from people? What are some things you do so that your values don't come out? You don't say, you should not have sex with your boyfriend because you're not married. Let's just say that was your value. What can you do so you don't say what your values are? So someone comes to you and says, I want to have sex with my partner. And you say you shouldn't. How can you keep those values? Remind myself that I would be taking their individuality away. Yeah. Yes. They're adults. Yep. What information would they need to know? So thinking about, okay, maybe I need to give some factual information then. Yep. I might talk about consent and if both are ready for that decision. Yeah. Great. Ask them if they've considered I don't know, being safe. Talk with a trusted friend, emphasize sex as a personal decision and not mine to make, and that I just want them to have the information they need. Yeah, great. Yeah, so really like understanding your role in this and asking questions, giving information. Yeah. Excellent. So that's one tip, is keeping our values to ourselves. And sexuality has a lot of values in it, right? About what's okay and not okay. And I'm always surprised that people still get the message that you should wait till you're married, because really that came from years ago when people got married very young. And now people wait much longer to get married, usually late 20s, 30s. And so that's a big ask. But anyway, so common values are ones that we can share. Sometimes people call them universal values. So it's important to respect others by treating them well and listening to them. So if I asked all of you that, do you agree with that? I'm pretty much everyone's going to raise their hand. I can't imagine people wouldn't. It's important to get consent from a sweetheart for being sexual. Yeah. So we're saying those are like kindness, respect, those sorts of values we do share. Obeying the law, or at least knowing the law. Relationships should be equal and positive without violence and abuse, right? That's, those are universal. We all want that for everyone. So those are okay to share. It's things like what kind of sex is okay or not, who a person should be sexual with, any kind of sexual decisions that others make that we don't agree with, opinions, and you shouldn't do that. Okay, I'm worried that my son will get someone pregnant. He says he understands what to do to be safe, but then there's the intimate moment when thinking might be confused. Yes, he has made mistakes with big consequences and generally involve his very poor memory. Any tips? He'll be 18 this year and has a long-term girlfriend who he wants to have sex with. Yeah, I mean, I think talking about birth control, does his partner have birth control? What is she using? Has he talked to her about what she would do if she accidentally got pregnant? Having those conversations would be really helpful. And, I think also for what I talk to males a lot about is the way the laws are set up, she really has the final say about what happens if there's an unplanned pregnancy. So how does he feel about that? Would he want to become a father or not? What if he gets her pregnant and I'm sorry, I got distracted by the chat. And she decides to continue the pregnancy and have the child. So I think going through sort of, yeah, I know, yes, okay, you've got birth control, or you've talked to her about birth control, or you're going to use condoms, whatever it might be. What if it doesn't work? So there's emergency contraception, and then what if she does get pregnant? What will you do? And then maybe it's also, you can be sexual with someone and not have, if you're talking about a male and a female, vaginal sex. So there's ways to be sexual with people that aren't risking pregnancy. And then somebody wrote birth control is his responsibility as well. Absolutely. So talking about that. And I think a lot of people worry about boys because they don't have as many options for birth control. And so, they've got condoms and vasectomy where, females have more options around preventing pregnancy. So many times they worry about boys. The other thing that I say to males is keep your sperm to yourself, because as soon as you give it away, someone else can decide whether you become a parent or not. So using condoms would be, even if she is on birth control, using condoms gives you more control to, not give your sperm away. That's another thing. So hopefully that helps. But yeah, it's scary, not sure what's going to happen, and trying to give them as much information as you can, and have those conversations about what would happen if she did get pregnant. All right, so values. Okay, we got a few more minutes. So as I mentioned, give positive messages. Here's just a few tips. Use inclusive language. So rather than, to a guy, male student, do you want a girlfriend? You're sort of assuming heterosexuality. We want to use things like, do you want a partner? Do you want to be in a relationship? Do you want a sweetheart? Something like that. Significant other, sometimes people will use. So we want to use inclusive language and not assume. We don't have to know all the answers, and I'm going to give you a couple of resources that are really helpful for self-advocates, and even for yourselves to read and just hear how the language is, written and that sort of thing. It's all right to feel embarrassed too. Many of us didn't get positive messages, and so, or any messages or any conversation. So sometimes it is embarrassing, and that's okay. It's okay to answer the question later. Maybe you're in a public place and it's kind of a private discussion. You can say, let's wait till we're in a private place to talk about this. Give facts and a range of opinions. We want to be really concrete, which I'm sure you're aware, and we may have to get very graphic and detailed as well. Use lots of repetition, and also use the media. There was a developmental disability group that had a soap opera support group, and they would watch soap operas and then have a discussion about relationships. And so we can use media, and sometimes media is easier than our own. Like if you're thinking of this person that talked about her son, talking about your own relationship is kind of more, it's harder, but talking about that couple over there in the media, in the movie, in the whatever, is kind of easier to sort of have this conversation about, less personal. So use media for discussions like, what do you think about the way that she treated her partner? So we can use media. And then I'm going to go another 10 minutes or so, and then I'll open it up for questions. But I often will think of there's different types of questions that you can get from students. So you might get a factual question. You might get an opinion value question, which we already talked about. You want to give it back to them, right? Roll it back to them. Or they might ask you a personal question, and how to manage that as well. So I'm going to give you a model for answering factual questions. So this is a model from the Center for Sex Education, and it's, there's lots of different models out there. It's great for parents as well. And so the person asks a question, and you can first start off with reassuring the person that it's a good question to ask. So you can say something like, that's a great question, or I'm really glad you asked me that. And so you're kind of giving that message that, what a great question. That's a nice response to get, right? The second thing you want to do is find out what the person thinks or is really asking. So similar to what the person wrote about oral sex and kissing, you want to find out what they think something is, or where did they hear that word, or because it gives you it's sort of a mini needs assessment. You understand the context around the word, but also what they might already know. And then that joke, I tell this at all my trainings, and you probably know the joke where the young person comes home and says, Dad, where did I come from? And the dad goes into this whole story about the sperm and the egg and everything. And then the kid says, oh, that's funny, because Johnny's from Kansas City. Right. So if you had, if he had said, well, where do you think you came from? And he said, I think I came from Colombia. And that's right. That's exactly where you came from. No sperm in the egg mentioned. So finding out where the question comes from, and also what they might be asking. And it also gives you a little more time to kind of think about how you want to answer something as well. So it sort of slows things down, because when we get a question about sexuality, it can almost feel jarring. It's like, ugh, kind of shocking. So it gives you a little bit of like, that's a really good question. And where did you hear that? Or what do you know? Do you know anything about that word? Do you have any idea what it means? So it kind of gives you a little time to slow down. And then you want to decide what message you want to give. So that goes back to the beginning of this webinar, talking about messages and giving positive messages. And oftentimes they're very reassuring messages, like it's normal for that to happen, or, something along those lines, or it's okay to be curious. Lots of people have questions like this, and this can be complicated or confusing to understand. So any kind of messages that reassure. And then you answer the question simply using really medical terminology. And then you encourage the person to give you feedback. So this might be, sort of like a teach back. Can you teach me what I just taught you about that? Tell me what you got from what I told you, or, sort of try to get an assessment that they understood, rather than, does that make sense? And then they go, even though it doesn't, right? So we want to kind of check in, see if they got it. So we won't do this because of time, but what I usually do is have people try to answer this question: what is a boner? right? So using this model, someone who's 21 says to you, what's a boner? And then you can say, that's a really good question. What do you think it is? Or where did you hear that? Or, kind of get some information. And then you can, tell the person what it is. And one other thing with factual information is giving physical and social aspects and sometimes emotional aspects to that question. So you could say it's a nickname for an erection, which is when the penis gets hard. So it's very factual, matter of fact. So that's a physical aspect. It's something that should happen in private. And it can feel good when you're in private and the penis gets hard, but it can also feel embarrassing if it happens in public. So you can talk about public and private. And so if you have an erection when you're in public, you want to go to a private place, or you want to find out a way to hide it, because it will make you feel uncomfortable and other people feel uncomfortable. So it's not just penis gets hard, right? You're also putting in sort of this public, private, social aspects, and also emotional around it. Can feel good or it can feel embarrassing or, okay. And the evaluation just came in, folks. So you can think about how you might answer that question. And then this one, we already talked about, we don't want to share our values. We're just going to roll it back and say, should I have sex with my boyfriend? It's a great question. Well, what are you thinking? Are you ready? How would you know you were ready? What do you need in your relationship before you do that? So we're having them explore these things. Personal questions. And what I'm always saying is when we get a question, we want to try to keep the conversation going. So we could set a boundary, which we should, right? That's a personal, private question, and I'm not going to answer that. But we also want to keep the conversation going. So sometimes what we want to do is just bring it away from ourselves, right? But the topic is sex. So we might say something like, sometimes when people ask that question, they're wondering, how often do people have sex? Or maybe they just have lots of questions about what is sex. Do you have any questions for me about that? So you've gotten it away from you, but you're still acting open and approachable so you can have the conversations. So those are just some tips. And then the last thing is thinking about, sexual self-advocacy and having people learn to speak up. To advocate for themselves around sexuality and relationships. And so you can use different examples of how teaching people to speak up. Maybe it's to a staff person about wanting privacy in your room, or maybe it's telling your parents that you want to start dating, or telling your partner you really like them, or telling your partner you're ready for sex. Like, how do we speak up in our relationships as well? So I'll open it up for questions, and then I'm going to talk about a couple of resources for you. Are there any questions? I did get that one that we talked about. Are there others that people want to talk about? You can throw them in there. I'll go through these resources if you can think of any particular questions. But here are some resources, and these are for self-advocates, really, but it's great information. So this is the research, the Office of, I think it's actually Organization of Autism Research, and it's the Sex Ed Guide for Self-Advocates, and that's the link to it. But it has lots of really good content. It's very text heavy in my view, compared to some of the people that I work with. It's not, I wouldn't say it's necessarily in plain language, or it might be in plain language, but it's a lot of language. But there's also a podcast. So if you have people that aren't strong readers, they could listen to the content as well. So that's a great resource. And even for yourself too, just to learn about the different topics. And then this other one is Sex Ed for people with IDD. And it was created by the National Center for Independent Living and the Rooted in Rights organization. And it's lots of, I think there are 8 or maybe 10 videos, and they're very short videos, and they're taught by someone with a developmental disability for people with developmental disabilities. So if the, if student's going to wants to learn about consent, you can show the consent video. There's also lots of resources on my website, elevatoustraining.com. And there's a resource page, lots of articles, some lessons, sort of how do you teach healthy boundaries. And so lots of different content there as well. So I see a couple questions. So let me just answer those. My students know that the penis goes in the vagina, but I had a student ask, well, then what? How does the sperm come out, I'm assuming? What can I, how can I explain the physics of sex in a professional way? Yeah, well, you could say, I mean, I think how the sperm comes out would be one question. And there's lots of different ways the sperm comes out, but you could say that it's the tip of the penis that's really sensitive. And so when the person has their penis in the vagina, they move their penis in and out of the vagina. Penis has to be hard and the vagina needs to be wet. Otherwise, it's hard to get in there. So you could talk about that. I mean, that's true, right? You could also talk about if it's a person with female sexual parts and the clitoris. And so you could get into sexual pleasure as well. But it sounds like you're sort of wondering about in your role, is that too much? It's one thing if you're teaching a class, right? And that's part of the class. But is that sort of what you're wondering? Because you can absolutely talk about this in class, so I'll just see if there's any more with that question, but do you think it's best to teach whole group or break students into groups by gender? I recommend all genders in one class, but there's trade-offs, right? I mean, I think I used to split people into male and female, and then as I've had transgender students, and I could see they're feeling uncomfortable, like going into one or the other. And so I for that reason, I think it's good to just, like, gender doesn't matter. We all need to know about all these parts and all these things. And also the other reason is, if people are going to be in relationships with someone of the other gender, they've had experience talking about these topics already, right? So before the actual encounter, it's not the first time they've talked about it in front of someone with another gender. So that's my recommendation. But I've also had classes with with all genders, and there was a couple, a man and a woman, that were a couple, and she wasn't asking any questions. And we actually divided the group into two, but it wasn't by gender, but we wanted to split them up just to see. And she had so many questions that she just didn't feel comfortable asking in front of her partner. So, it's a trade-off, but I would go with whole group, preferably. Yeah. So, and then just to tell you too, I have a curriculum that it's 22 lessons and lots of topics, not just sex, lots and lots of topics around communication and decision making. So and some universities have bought the curriculum and are using it. And there's a guide in the beginning around how do you get a group together and how do you become a good sexuality educator. All right, so can you recommend any good resources for emerging adults who are transitioning from high school? I work with the newly developed inclusive higher ed program, and we're going to bring students to campus and are thinking about all sorts of trainings that we need to keep staying. Yeah, absolutely. So I do have you could definitely use these resources that I mentioned, but also the curriculum that I wrote is another option. And like I said, they're hour and a half, 22 lessons, lots of good content. So that's another resource. There's also, we have a slide deck that you can purchase as well to go with it. And we also have communication boards and cards for students who are nonverbal or non-speaking that go with the lessons as well. Do instructors need to be certified? No. In the field of sexuality education, anyone can be a sexuality educator, but there's a certain effectiveness, that you should have. So you don't have to be certified. So people can buy my curriculum, other curriculum, and teach. I I mentioned this 3-day training, which you get the sexuality education curriculum, you get a parent workshop, leading parent workshop curriculum, and leading staff training curriculum. And in those, you're not considered a certified sexuality educator, but if you pass this assessment at the end, you get a certificate of completion. And it just shows a little more credibility. But the way to become certified as a sexuality educator, you have to teach a certain number of hours and learn a certain number of hours. So you really can't get certified by any entity at this point. You could go, I think there's a program, a certification in sex ed at the University of Michigan. And then ASECT, American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. They give you a certification, and I just became certified, so it can take many years. And then you can put CSE next to your name, but you can teach without being certified. And like I said, the curriculum that I have, there's a manual too. So it talks about how to be a good sexuality educator, all that. But what people do sometimes is they buy the curriculum, they look through it, and then they decide, I need more training, so they might go to the 3-day, or they might go to another kind of training or something. So yeah, so that you don't have to be certified. I haven't had the opportunity to explore your curriculum yet, but the curriculum, I adapt my sex ed lessons from focus on abstinence first, then ways to have sex safely. It's geared towards students with IDD, and most of the scenarios state that you should know someone a long time before having sex, like 1 to 2 years. Yeah, I'm wondering the best way to approach this. I typically adapt this and make it more appropriate for college students and focus on student values, how everyone makes different decisions. Yeah, so the curriculum that I have, it's for high school and adults. I don't even talk about abstinence. I really talk more about sexual decision making. There is a little bit around abstinence in the section on sexually transmitted infections, which just says, if used effectively, it's 100%, but I don't even use that terminology. Now, schools sometimes want that terminology and they want that focus, but that's just not what I believe is effective. I think people can make their own decisions, especially if they're on a campus. They're going to have to make their own decisions. So how do we give them as much information as possible? And there's a piece that a lesson on sexual acts and being sexual with another person. And I talk about, some people have sex with someone they just met. Some people have sex with, just sort of giving these options. It's not one way and only one way. I don't cover the effects of alcohol and drugs on sexual decision making. I think that's missing from my curriculum because, I've spent lots of times with people with disabilities at conferences, and they like to party. And I don't know that they've ever had any kind of education around that. So I don't have anything on that, and I'd like to add that to the curriculum. But I'm sure there's some good stuff out there that you could adapt. Which is probably what you do all the time, right? This is my email. If you have any, yes, I agree. It is lacking in most sex ed. Yeah. If you have any questions, you can email me after. That's my email. I'm happy to respond if you have any other questions. And I mentioned the sexuality education curriculum. We also have a building healthy relationships at work curriculum. So I worked with Project Search, National Project Search, to create a curriculum. So it doesn't go as far into like sex and sexual acts and all those things, but more about different types of relationships and how do you find a partner. And because what they were finding is people were losing their job, not because they couldn't do the job, but because they were following someone around in the workplace because they had a crush on them, or they ended up in the broom closet with a partner. And, so sort of like the rules of relation, being a sexual being at work kind of thing. I also mentioned the three-day certificate program. You're not certified, but you get a certificate. We also have 90-minute workshops online, and I do in-services, and we also have 2 self-study courses, one for parents on how to talk to your kids about sexuality, so you can go through the modules whenever, And then also developmental disability and sexuality 101. So sort of more of this kind of thing where you learn more tools and how to talk about it. Great. Okay. So great resources. And I think that might be it, except maybe one more. One thing you want to do to help students with IDD become sexual self-advocates. If you can throw those in the chat, tell us what you think you might do moving forward. Be positive. Great. Factual. Excellent. Give them a voice and implement policy change. Yeah, great idea. Policy is really helpful. Ask more questions. Good. Yes, yes, yes. Give them educated choices, encourage questions, be positive, host workshops and classes. Excellent. Great. Great ideas. Yeah. Good. So I think we're done now. I think there's an evaluation and I'm around if anyone has any last thoughts, factual, a link to the evaluation. Anything else before we wrap up? My dog just started whining. He always does this. Thank you all for coming and follow up. Oh yeah, let me give you my email again. I'll go back in the PowerPoint so you can see it. Yes, please reach out. Yes, thank you all for being here. Oh yes.